Welcome to Sidebar, a podcast by Courthouse News. I'm your host, Kelsey Reichman, coming to you from Washington, D.C. Today on Sidebar, the Epstein files. Jeffrey Epstein is still making headlines in 2025, 6 years after his death. Why? How could one pedophile consume so much national and international attention? And why is it still having such an outsized influence on politics? As I was reporting for this episode, I headed to Capitol Hill for what I thought would be a typical press conference from a few lawmakers hoping to keep the Epstein story in the news. But what I found changed my understanding of what's actually at stake in this moment.
27 years. For 27 years, I thought I was the only one that Jeffrey Epstein raped. I believed I was alone, and I was kept silent by the shame that was inside me and by the fear outside in the world. But I wasn't the only one. None of us were. And what once kept us silent now fuels that fire and the power of our voices.
Jess Michaels was raped by Epstein in 1991 when she was 22. Survivors of Epstein's abuse gathered on a small stage on the Capitol lawn, taking turns telling their stories. 4 other women, also victims, stood shoulder to shoulder with Jess as she shared her story at the rally. And as they spoke through tears, their emotions were palpable throughout the crowd. And as the crowd grew in size, so did their calls for accountability for the victims.
We are not the footnotes in some infamous Predator's tabloid article. We are the experts and the subjects of this story. Yes. We are the proof that fear did not break us. Yes. And we don't just speak for ourselves, but for every survivor whose story is still unspoken. Yes. For those not with us today. Yes. For Virginia, whose courage lit the path and opened the door for us to walk through.
Virginia Giuffre was one of the most prominent survivors of Epstein's abuse. Giuffre said Epstein sexually abused her from 1999 to 2002 and trafficked her to other powerful men like Prince Andrew. In 2021, she sued the British royal for sexually abusing her when she was 17. Andrew settled the case and stepped back from his royal duties, but maintains that he never had sex with Giuffre. Giuffre was one of the first victims to speak about her abuse, making her the face of Epstein's abuse and many of the conspiracies surrounding him. Trump recently suggested that Epstein stole Giuffre from his Mar-a-Lago resort. She died by suicide in April. Her family attended the Capitol Hill rally. Amanda Roberts said she hoped to keep Virginia's advocacy alive.
It's gut-wrenching. Because there's this point, right? She should be here. She would be here. She fought for this to the very last day she was here. And so we just feel this pull to pick up that torch, to pick up that mantle, to make sure that her voice stays alive.
Sky Roberts was tearful as he spoke about his sister's advocacy. He said victims want accountability, and the big turnout on Capitol Hill demonstrated momentum toward that goal.
I had a conversation with one of the survivors, and she said Virginia was like 15 of us. And we owe this to her. And I think that's so powerful because it shows a lot of strength. This is the most amount of survivors you've seen in a singular place, possibly ever. And they're coming out because this is important, and this is a very important moment in our history. And it's important for our politicians to understand that we're not backing down.
6 years after Epstein's death, his victims are still waiting for some form of accountability. And for many survivors, this moment was decades in the making. So what's the holdup? Why won't the government release information about their investigation into Epstein? Advocates have one theory.
Cover up. Who are they protecting? Not the survivors. They have protected the powerful for too long, and it's time. The American people are ready for this.
It's not just the survivors who think something is fishy about this case. How could there be so much attention and interest in a case, but so little movement? What is it about Jeffrey Epstein that has sunk its claws into the national discourse? And how has a rumor about boxes within the bowels of the Justice Department become such an Achilles heel for the seemingly impenetrable MAGA base? Is this even really about Epstein anymore? I've assembled an all-star team to get to the bottom of this mystery. Fellow Sidebar host and CNS reporter for the so-called Sovereign District of New York Federal Court beat, Josh Russell, resident Congress expert and part-time motorsports correspondent, Ben Weiss, and last but certainly not least, CNS's DC Federal Courts aficionado and Justice Department sleuth, Ryan Knappenberger. Josh, can you start us off with some background?
We're talking about Jeffrey Epstein, the mysterious financier and convicted sex offender who is believed to have trafficked and sexually abused over 1,000 women, mostly teenage girls, since the 1990s. He had apartments in Paris and Manhattan's posh Upper East Side, a villa in Palm Beach, Florida, and a ranch in New Mexico, in addition to his infamous private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands. He shuttled numerous politicians and celebrities internationally on his Boeing private jet, nicknamed Lolita Express, in reference to the underage girls that reportedly joined those flights. He was arrested in 2006 but pled guilty in Florida to state charges of soliciting and procuring a minor for prostitution in a sweetheart deal that allowed him to serve 13 months in a work release program, make payments to victims, and register as a sex offender instead of potentially serving a life sentence. Epstein's sex trafficking operation and the botching of that Florida litigation was detailed in journalist Julie K. Brown's 2018 exposés in the Miami Herald titled Perversion of Justice. He was arrested in 2019 on federal charges brought by the Southern District of New York, but never stood trial because he died a month after his arrest in what was ruled to be a suicide by hanging in his federal jail cell. Epstein's connections to high-powered individuals, combined with the lurid nature of his crimes, were catnip for people who were already convinced that there's some cabal of elite pedophiles running the country. This is similar to the Pizzagate conspiracy, completely unfounded claims about the Clintons being connected to a child sex trafficking and ritual blood harvesting operation in the basement of a DC pizza restaurant, Comet Ping Pong, which didn't even have a basement.
There's also, of course, former President Bill Clinton's connections to Epstein, which stir up a whole host of Clinton conspiracy theories. And we can't forget about the royal connection to these theories, with Prince Andrew being a well-documented Epstein associate. Epstein also had connections to high-level Israeli officials, which then grabbed the attention of other conspiracy theorists, some which were blatantly anti-Semitic. Melina Tapos, a philosopher in theoretical philosophy at Lund University, said that the conflict in the Middle East, Trump's re-election, and the popularity of the Drain the Swamp message created just the right conditions for the Epstein conspiracies to explode.
I think it's kind of a perfect storm when you factor all those things together, and we had the whole COVID pandemic, so a huge distrust in authority that became worry for people in the US, but I would say all over the world. And then coupled then with Trump, and then to our time now, I think the Jeffrey Epstein conspiracy theory speaks to a lot of people who think or who see this or sees him and what he was doing as part of this establishment and different controls that are playing on our democracy, rather than having this transparency.
Conspiracies, of course, aren't new to politics. Think about the JFK assassination. But the way Trump has used conspiracies to his advantage is unique.
Donald Trump has, I think, is worldwide known now as the conspiracy theory in chief, right? That catched on pretty quick, that nickname for him. I think he just really realizes that it works. We don't want to be deceived, right? So we care if there is some type of corruption or some hidden agenda. And I think he realized pretty quick that it was appealing for people when he talked about conspiracies.
Despite his own connections to Epstein, Donald Trump runs on the idea that his administration will unmask the deep state pedophiles conspiring to keep information about Epstein's case secret. As a sign of goodwill, Trump appoints Dan Bongino, a prominent right-wing podcaster, that promoted Epstein conspiracies for deputy FBI director. The Justice Department also ramps up excitement for the big reveal. Right, Ryan?
That's right. But initially, so back in February, Attorney General Pam Bondi invites a bunch of conservative influencers, think the libs of TikTok lady Chaya Raichik, to the White House and hands out these big binders that are supposedly the first edition of the Epstein files. That release included previously published pilot logs from the prosecution of Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein's so-called Black Book, which had also already been released. A so-called evidence list, 3 pages cataloging material found via searches of Epstein's New York and U.S. Virgin Island properties, was one of the newly released documents. Then she seemingly confirms the existence of the Epstein client list.
Releasing the list of Jeffrey Epstein's clients? Will that really happen?
It's sitting on my desk right now to review. That's been a directive by President Trump. I'm reviewing that. I'm reviewing JFK files, MLK files. That's all in the process of being reviewed because that was done at the directive of the president from all of these agencies.
So have you seen anything that you said, oh my gosh?
Not yet.
So according to a July 6 memo, the Justice Department determined after an exhaustive review of Epstein's case via searches of over 300 gigabytes of data and physical evidence that there was no incriminating client list.
That ignites a firestorm and a whole new set of conspiracy theories because of Trump's connection to Epstein.
Absolutely. So earlier this year, the Wall Street Journal reported on this body letter Trump supposedly sent to Epstein for his 50th birthday. According to the journal, Trump drew this image of a naked woman and signed his John Hancock below her waist, mimicking pubic hair. The journal did not include the letter itself in the article, but nonetheless, Trump is suing the newspaper and the reporters who authored the piece for a total of $10 billion.
Ben, unlike their Republican counterparts, Democrats typically steer clear of conspiracies. But not this time. What's different?
What's different is that the debacle around the release, or not release, of the Epstein files has proven to be something of a potent issue, even among the president's own supporters, many of whom believe that Trump would use his position to pull back the curtain on some elite cabal of child predators. Democrats have clocked this as a vulnerability, and they've gone all in on the idea that Trump and his allies are slow-walking the Epstein files because they have something to hide. For example, that the president's own name appears in those documents. And recently you've seen Democrats dig in hard on this issue. Top lawmakers have even framed Trump's federal takeover of D.C. as a distraction engineered to take minds off of the White House's refusal to publish the Epstein files. In Congress, House Democrats have called for a hearing on the administration's handling of the documents. Democratic lawmakers have contended that the Trump administration's longstanding claims about the Epstein files needed to be submitted to public scrutiny, and they've demanded that Republican committee leaders in the House compel Bondi and Bongino, as well as FBI Director Kash Patel and Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, to testify before the panel. Republicans, though, have largely been resistant to calls for legislative action on the Epstein files. Only a handful of GOP lawmakers have signed on to a bipartisan measure led by Kentucky Representative Thomas Massie and California Representative Ro Khanna, which would force their release. House Speaker Mike Johnson has urged his colleagues to give the White House space to continue reviewing the Epstein files for potential release, and he's accused Democrats and even fellow Republican Massie of playing political games with their calls to publish the documents now. But despite Johnson's complaints, the Democratic pressure campaign has notched a few key political victories in the last couple of months. Republicans in the House Rules Committee called off a panel meeting after Democrats attempted to force a separate vote on a resolution calling for the public release of Epstein documents. The abrupt halt of Rules Committee proceedings meant that lawmakers couldn't advance a tranche of unrelated bills that would have gotten the floor vote, which forced House leadership to schedule an early start to the chamber's August recess. And the House Oversight Committee approved a subpoena for Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's former partner and accomplice, who's currently serving a 20-year prison sentence for her role in helping the late financier sexually traffic underage girls. Democrats also forced votes on a tranche of other subpoenas to former FBI directors and attorneys general from the Trump, Biden, and Obama administrations, though Republicans required the committee to compel testimony from the Clintons as well.
With Epstein dead, his victims focused on Maxwell's trial for accountability. Josh, what did we learn?
Maxwell's trial in 2021, which resulted in guilty verdicts and a 20-year prison sentence, laid out Maxwell's role in the predatory pattern of selecting, recruiting, and grooming vulnerable teenage girls for abuse by Epstein and others. At the trial, prosecutors highlighted bank records of 3 payments from Epstein to Maxwell in the early to mid-2000s totaling over $30 million, which they described as, quote, a payment for committing terrible crimes with Jeffrey Epstein.
What more can lawmakers learn from Maxwell?
If Ghislaine were to be fully candid in her testimony and not invoke the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination to avoid testifying, she could potentially provide details on that sweetheart deal in the mid-2000s, which she maintains on appeal shields her from criminal prosecution, pursuant to a clause that protects Epstein's alleged co-conspirators. Federal prosecutors, meanwhile, have argued that the non-prosecution agreement applied only in Florida and did not bind New York, where both Epstein and Maxwell were charged by the Manhattan U.S. Attorney's Office.
Maxwell has actually brought this argument to the Supreme Court, where criminal defense experts say she poses a decent question. These experts argue that criminal defendants need to trust that the government will uphold their end of the bargain when making plea agreements. Of course, it really only matters if the 9 justices on the Supreme Court also think that Maxwell presents a worthy question.
She could also potentially shed light on Epstein's shady finances and the roles of his 2 major financial services clients, Les Wexner and Leon Black, and how Epstein's money was used to fund the international sex trafficking operation.
But we didn't get there. Before Maxwell could testify, she was moved from the Florida prison where she'd been serving her sentence to a minimum security prison in Texas. Special conditions were made for Maxwell's transfer because the Texas camp typically only houses nonviolent offenders.
Why?
We don't know exactly why she was transferred, but the move came just days after Maxwell met with Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, who also happens to be Trump's former personal attorney. There are a few of those in the Justice Department these days. House Democrats demanded a transcript of Blanche's meeting with Maxwell, arguing that the White House, quote, may now be attempting to tamper with a crucial witness. They said the meeting added to the strong appearance that the administration is attempting to cover up the extent of Trump's relationship with Epstein, noting that the Deputy Attorney General interviewed Maxwell with no line prosecutors present, and that he met with her just days after the Justice Department fired Maureen Comey, a federal prosecutor on the Epstein and Maxwell cases.
After outcry about the secrecy of the meeting, the Justice Department actually released a transcript and audio recording of the meeting.
Before we start asking questions, I know that you've been given by your lawyer a copy of what's called a proffer agreement, and I just want to spend 2 minutes making sure that you understand what governs our conversation today. The most important part of this agreement is that this isn't a cooperation agreement, meaning that by you meeting with us today, we're really just meeting. I'm not promising to do anything. I'm not promising to ask Judge Nathan or any of the judges that's been assigned to your case to do anything. We're just talking.
While Blanche said that the interview was not conditioned on a promise to do anything, in particular a presidential pardon, the government could not use that testimony against her. That doesn't necessarily dispel questions about why Maxwell would want to talk to the federal government, though.
You wanted to speak with somebody from the government about not only your case, but about everything that's been in the media and that's been publicized about Mr. Epstein in your case.
That is true, and I did speak to him, and I did ask him did tell him that I was very keen to talk to anyone, because no one from the government at any time ever since the inception of the case, so dating back to the early 2000s, has ever spoken to me, and indeed I believe ever reached out to me at any time to even speak to me, and that includes up to when I was indicted and prosecuted. I believe that, or I understand, I should say rather, that my attorneys at the time did tell the government that I wanted to speak to them, because I was very keen to meet with anyone so that I could tell or have them ask me any question. I've never had any problem to speak to anybody, and I offered myself, and I kept asking if they would meet with me so that I could talk to them, for whatever reason.
However, it's important to note that Maxwell was previously charged with perjury for lying in a 2016 deposition about her knowledge of Epstein's alleged behavior, though prosecutors dropped those charges after a jury found her guilty of sex trafficking in 2021. Nonetheless, Maxwell told Blanche that she had never seen any inappropriate behavior from President Trump.
That in the very beginning of the conversation, you mentioned President Trump in the early 90s.
Yes.
What did you observe as far as President Trump and his relationship with you or Mr. Epstein?
Well, I just want to say for my relationship with President Trump, relationship's a big word, but I just want to say that I met him, or I believe I may have, because of my father in the 90s.
Yep. Okay.
So my father liked him very much, and he really liked his wife as well, because they were both Czechoslovakian. And as far as I'm concerned, President Trump was always very cordial and very kind to me. And I just want to say that I admire his extraordinary achievement in becoming the president now, and I like him, and I've always liked him. So that is the sum and substance of my entire relationship with him.
What about Mr. Epstein's relationship with him?
I don't know how they met, and I don't know how they became friends. I certainly saw them together, and I remember the few times I observed them together that they were friendly. I mean,
was that in social settings, or was that in private settings?
I believe I only ever saw them in social settings. I don't recall any private settings.
Well, that settles it, right?
Democrats were not totally satisfied. They pointed to Maxwell's history of playing fast and loose with the facts and argued that she was after a presidential pardon. And they also argued that Blanche, Trump's personal lawyer, had an interest in shielding him from any unsavory Epstein revelations. Still, the congressional Epstein intrigue is far from over, regardless of Maxwell's statements to the Justice Department. Those 8 other former White House officials subpoenaed by the Oversight Committee are set to testify in depositions starting this month and continuing into the fall. Targets include former Attorneys General Merrick Garland, Bill Barr, and Eric Holder, as well as ex-FBI Director James Comey, Special Counsel Robert Mueller, and other top Justice Department officials across 3 presidential administrations, in addition to the Clintons. In his letter to former President Clinton, Oversight Committee Chair and Kentucky Representative Jim Comer cited his own admission that he flew in Epstein's private plane on 4 separate occasions and said that Clinton was, quote, allegedly close with Maxwell. The subpoena to Hillary Clinton, who served as Secretary of State under former President Barack Obama, also tied her to Epstein and Maxwell. But Comer also noted that lawmakers believed her position as head of the State Department may have provided her knowledge about federal efforts to, quote, combat international sex trafficking operations of the type run by Mr. Epstein.
It isn't just Democrats, though, right? Some Republicans are breaking from Trump, too, which feels unique.
It's complicated. For the most part, rank-and-file Republicans are pretty mum about efforts to release the Epstein files. Only a handful of GOP lawmakers besides Massey, I'm thinking Marjorie Taylor Greene and a few other outspoken conservatives, have been pushing as hard to get the documents out there.
Well, it seems logical that the connections between Trump and Epstein would draw scrutiny. There's always been something illogical about the president's relationship with the convicted sex offender. Trump used these conspiracies to draw many people into the MAGA base, but Melina Tapas explained that some people may feel betrayed by Trump's dismissal of their beliefs during his second term.
Going back to how the world has changed, and we're so much more distrusting, especially of normal journalism or media, mainstream media. So a lot of the podcasters that a lot of people claimed helped him get elected are now talking about that this is I think Candace Owens said she called it the terminal cancer for the MAGA movement, because she is so disappointed in him not releasing it, and even trying to gaslight his supporters that you're still talking about Epstein, right? That's what he said in response to a journalist asking him about it.
Imagine 2 groups within the Epstein conspiracy. Those who supported Trump because of their views on draining the swamp, etc., versus those who were just loyal to Trump.
But what we see with Trump and the Epstein case or conspiracy is that his base were more committed to the conspiracy theory about the deep state, so to speak, that whole story or narrative. The ones that are sticking to him, they're excusing it by saying, don't you think that Biden would have released this if Trump was in it somehow, or they're excusing it. They're making up excuses for Trump, doubling down on his decision not to share it. So there we see people that are committing to the group rather than the other type of conspiracy. So those ones are leaving.
So while there's some obsession with Epstein himself, the conspiracies about him are a lot bigger than one man.
people conspire. It's quite unique to humans to conspire. Actually, we don't see it as much in animals. Actually, in fact, we don't see it in animals at all because it requires a lot of cognition. So, for example, theory of mind, we have to be able to communicate and have a language where we can do this very efficiently. So it's very unique for humans to conspire. But in that, then, we've also developed the capability to suspect it in others. As a way to protect ourselves, evolutionary, we can see that, it was very important to be able to spot the conspiracy against you to be able to survive. But what we see is that it requires a lot of cognition and a lot of all this puzzle hunting or gathering. And because we're so good at that as humans, it's a very good skill we have, actually, to be interested and curious. So then we see that sometimes it's talked about as against one individual. We see with, for example, Bill Gates during the vaccine, that the vaccine was his way to microchip everyone. But really it was something much deeper that people were talking about, not just that, but this kind of control over people. And so one reason is that a lot of people that feel oppressed use this as a very powerful way of explaining why they're oppressed. And so that then requires this fuller story than just one person like Jeffrey Epstein.
On the surface, Trump validated suspicions about a wealthy businessman who hurt many people, but he might not have wanted to endorse the underlying grievances over power structures in the US.
Perhaps why we see this so much more stronger in America, like conspiracy theories and people really, really latching on to them, I think is because in Europe, if you're an average person in Europe, you're much more protected. If you're a very, strong person who's really successful, you have more freedom in the US than you do in Europe. But the average citizen in Europe is more protected, like healthcare-wise, education-wise, and so on. So a conspiracy doesn't become as detrimental, kind of in a way, as it does in the US. Because in the US, for the average person, it really becomes, let's say you forgot to pay your healthcare insurance or you can't pay your education, then all of a sudden it seems like the system is rigged against you. And I think that's very powerful then. That's when conspiracy theories become very powerful for you to explain why you're in this situation. And so I think that's a difference. That's interesting, I think, between our ideas of freedom and our relationship with our institutions and authority.
While it's impossible to forget about Epstein's crimes, the stories of his actual victims have at times been sidelined.
Everywhere we turn, the story follows us. It's in headlines, jokes, music, grocery store checkout lines, random conversations that you hear people having in restaurants. For more than 20 years, we've been unable to escape it.
I asked Virginia Giuffre's family if they thought accountability for the victims had been derailed by conspiracy theories.
Why we came forward, because the real story was getting lost like a political tool. It felt like, it was one side versus the other side, and I think it was really what pushed us to come forward, because people needed to see that the real voices are the survivors in this story.
It's hard to hear Amanda over the crowd in that clip, but she said the conspiracies and partisan politics are why they came forward, because the real story was getting lost and the victims were being treated like a political tool, with one side versus the other. That pushed them to come forward because they wanted people to see that the real voices are the survivors. They said that one way to keep the focus on victims was for the government to give them more transparency and release the files. Congress released one trove of documents earlier in September, but most of the information was already public knowledge. The survivors and lawmakers pushed to release the entire trove of documents, holding an over 2-hour press conference. The survivors and demonstrators were frustrated by what they saw as half measures at transparency. Arik Fudali spoke for his client, a victim who was only identified as Rosa.
They should just release the files. Yes. No more slow rolling, no more meetings, no more strategy, no more interviews behind closed doors. Release the files and give you all and Rosa the accountability the exposure, and most importantly, the closure you all deserve. Thank you.
While many of the victims spoke through tears as they shared their stories on Capitol Hill, they were resolved that together they would find accountability.
This is what power looks like. Survivors united, voices joined, refusing to be dismissed. Know this, justice and accountability are not favors from the powerful. They are obligations decades overdue. This moment began with Epstein's crimes, but it's going to be remembered for survivors demanding justice, demanding truth, demanding accountability, and we will not stop until survivor voices shape justice, transform culture, and define the future.
It's still unclear whether there's enough support in Congress to release the remaining case files, and if they are released, if there'll be enough. However, Lisa Phillips, who was also abused by Epstein, said that if Congress would not release information about co-conspirators in the case, their survivors would create their own Epstein client list.
We know the names. Many of us were abused by them. Now together as survivors, we will confidentially compile the names we all know were regularly in the Epstein world. And it will be done by survivors and for survivors.
Thank you to Josh, Ben, and Ryan for helping us put all of these puzzle pieces in place. While this episode is at its end, the Epstein story is still very much alive. Make sure to follow our coverage at courthousenews.com for all the latest. Next time on Sidebar, the Supreme Court is back in session. But did they ever really leave? The High Court's typical summer hiatus has been interrupted by the shadow docket. If you're confused by the constant barrage of unexplained, unsigned opinions, you're not alone. Tune in for a breakdown of the court's new favorite tool and how Donald Trump is using it to his advantage. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss it.